And so Abram's preparing to go into this covenant with God. God puts him into a deep sleep, and God alone walks through the pieces. That this is not a covenant with Abraham, although that's what you hear when you get this theology taught to you. It is God making a covenant with himself on behalf of Abraham. Now that flows all the way through the Old Testament. You see every time the covenant is referenced, it is the covenant with the people in the land, with the people in the land.
Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm here with Dr. Jeff Myers. He is the president of Summit Ministries. It's an evangelical Christian organization that focuses on equipping young people with a biblical worldview. Today, we have Dr. Myers on because he's the author of Should Christians Support Israel? Seeking a Biblical Worldview in an Impossible Situation. So, Dr. Myers, thank you so much for being on the program. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, Peter, I'm glad to be with you. It's this is one of those topics that just keeps on going, and there are so many angles that we need to discuss.
Yeah, and the sad part is you're right, it does keep going. But I also think that part of the confusion is not coming from atheists or the political left or anything like that. I think a lot of it's coming from people who are Christians, or at least cloak themselves with Christianity. I won't necessarily say they are Christians. So with that being said, I mean, there's a lot of scriptures out there which supports Christians that should be supporting Israel. So let's start there before we go into a lot of other stuff. So for those listening, as a Christian from the beginning, why should they support Israel?
Yeah, Peter, this is one of those topics where if you had told me 5 years ago that I would have more in common with Chuck Schumer than I do with the professors at Wheaton College, I never would have believed you. But here's where we are, and I'm saying this as a guy who came up Presbyterian, so I'm very familiar with the Reformed argument. I'm going to start with that. Because when I wrote this book, Should Christians Support Israel?, I had just come back from a trip to the war zone. And I realized while I was there, I visited with Palestinians and with Israelis, with Jews, with Muslims, with everybody in between. And I realized we are in the middle of an immense propaganda war. And unthinking Christians have been duped into somehow supporting an anti-Israel cause. This is especially true with young people, and that is why I wrote the book, mainly for the students I work with at Summit Ministries who are trying to figure out how to apply a biblical worldview to the issues of the day. So the biblical case for Israel starts with the idea of the covenant, and it goes back to Abram, where God said to Abram, I'm going to make of you a great nation, and I will make my covenant with you, and it will be an everlasting covenant. And this was in Genesis, starting in Genesis chapter 12, and then it unfolds in a covenantal format that, if you haven't studied scripture intensively, might elude you. Abram is put into a deep sleep. Before he does go into this sleep, he divides the animals that are going to be a sacrifice. And this is a typical covenant ceremony of the time. It essentially, both parties would walk through in between the divided pieces of the body as if to say, if I violate this covenant, may what has been done to these animals be done to me. And so Abram's preparing to go into this covenant with God. God puts him into a deep sleep, and God alone walks through the pieces. That this is not a covenant with Abraham, although that's what you hear when you get this theology taught to you. It is God making a covenant with himself on behalf of Abraham. Now that flows all the way through the Old Testament. You see every time the covenant is referenced, it is the covenant with the people in the land, with the people in the land. Then you get to the ministry of the Apostle Paul. who had lots of troubles with the Jewish people of his time. But he said in Galatians chapter 3, those who believe are children of Abraham and are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. And then he repeats the Abrahamic blessing. Now, this is where Christians get all twisted around, because they say, well, if we believe and then we're the children of the covenant and then Jesus rose from the dead, then the Jews aren't relevant anymore. It's only the church. And this is what was taught by a lot of people. Martin Luther taught this. John Calvin taught this. A lot of people taught this, that essentially the church replaces Israel, that the church supersedes Israel. And so you hear these terms, replacement theology or supersessionism. Now, if you look carefully at what the Apostle Paul says in Galatians chapter 3, and then you look at other passages where he talks about the conflicts he was having with the Jews of his day, Romans 9, 10, 11, you realize that supersessionism doesn't cover the biblical aspect of the theology. It essentially uncouples the New Testament from the Old Testament. And I know a lot of people would prefer to do that. Andy Stanley, a pastor, wrote a book specifically on that topic, why we should uncouple the Old Testament from the New Testament. But if Jesus was a Jewish man, and he was born a Jew into a Jewish culture, he grew up as a Jew, he taught as a Jew, he died as a Jew, and my conviction is he was raised again as a Jew and is coming again as a Jew.
Right.
If you uncouple the Old Testament from the New Testament, you don't have a coherent faith.
Right.
Now, so, and I don't know if this is too much detail to go into, but there are a lot of my Reformed brothers and sisters right now who are saying, no, God divorced Israel. I was at a Christian college. I spoke to their students. The interactions went really well. Then I met with their faculty, 14 instructors at the university. For an hour and a half, they nailed me with questions on this topic, and they insisted that God had divorced Israel. And there's several things about that kind of theological perspective that really bother me. First of all, that we get to decide that God divorced, because God says, I will divorce you. There are a couple of passages in the prophets where the prophets talk using that language. But God alone is the one who decides. We don't get to decide that. We don't get to say we're so smart that we can develop our own theology around all of this and we can tell God what he did or didn't do. God, through the most consistent message through Scripture is God has made his covenant with the Jews, and we have been grafted into that covenant as Christians, not to replace the Jews, but somehow in God's mysterious plan to join them in his incredible plan that he has for bringing his kingdom to earth. And the second thing that I really felt bothered by in that particular discussion and in other discussions is the idea that somehow we believe as Christians we're individually saved, but the Jews can only be saved if they're all saved. There's kind of this collective, this collective salvation. You know, people talk about, well, do you believe in the salvation of the Jews? Well, I believe in the salvation of people.
Right.
And so the idea that somehow we take all of the Jews and we mass them all together and we condemn them all at one time on behalf of a Christian theology is crazy.
So, I guess this is nowhere where I was going to go, but I have to ask this question because when you were being, when you were before the Sanhedrin of professors, I'll just say it that way.
It did feel like I was on trial for sure.
But the verse for me is, especially with the New Testament piece of it, where Jesus says, that again, nothing, the law will not be abolished, the law or the prophets, but both will not be abolished until all is fulfilled, not when some of it's fulfilled. So his death and resurrection is only some of what the fulfillment is, because obviously we know even from Daniel that there's a lot more to come. So even if you take some of the stuff that was only at that time, how do they reconcile those verses of that? How do they reconcile? You're right. write Galatians or Galatians 3:28, how do they reconcile those type of verses with that thought process that there is replacement theology?
Well, in Reform circles, and again, I'm saying this is a guy who came up Presbyterian, there is a strong emphasis on the church, the institution of the church. And obviously, that's not new. That would have happened in Protestantism during the time of Luther, the development of Lutheranism, but it
Right.
also happened before in the Roman Catholic Church. So the idea that the church is going to be central to God's plan for the world is something that Christians have long believed. I think what happened, Peter, is it's almost like this little cancer got into the discussion whenever the question of the Jews came up. And, you know, I'm being very frank about this. If you read what Luther said about Jewish people,
it's awful.
It's horrifying. Yeah. It's horrifying. And a lot of my Jewish friends to this day will tell me, you know, I kind of like to become a Christian, but the Christians have been so evil toward Jews in history that I'm not sure what it is that I would be signing up for. One person told me specifically, I would become a Christian if it weren't for my mother. Quite literally, this person was saying to me, my mother is so triggered by the history of Christians mistreating Jews that if I were to become Christian, it would be viewed as a betrayal. And that's how this person saw it as a Jewish person. So this, I think the answer to your question is, if you have a high view of the church and you have a low view of Judaism, which is a lot of what happened in church history, then it would be very natural to conclude that, you know, God just got so disgusted with the Jews that they're just not relevant anymore. And if they're not relevant anymore, then the nation of Israel isn't even a Jewish nation. It doesn't count. It should not be looked at with any particular emphasis more than any of the other 192 nations of the world.
So taking that to its logical conclusion, though, could we not also say that if God has a history and a pattern and a character of being so disgusted with somebody that he's made an everlasting covenant with, that he can have the same thing with us and be like, yeah, you know what? I'm done with Christians. Y'all blown it. Y'all have done a terrible job. You know what? And Islam actually does believe that Jesus was a prophet. So I'm going to just kind of switch over to them. I mean, I'm just fickle like that, which I know is almost ridiculous when I say it out loud. But that seems to be the logical conclusion that I can pull from those that say that God was so disgusted with Israel that he has to change.
Well, this is the argument that Muslim theologians are making at this very moment, that Christians are irrelevant. I mean, they say, well, America's a Christian country, right? America's perverted, it's evil, and therefore God must have divorced the Christians too. So,
but how do Christians reconcile that? Because again, I'm thinking about those professors, and I recognize that's a sampling of what's out there, but I've heard several of those things that you've talked about, and that's where I kind of keep falling into the struggle with this, which is. It just seems to me that if you were to make the argument on that, then the same argument can apply to you. Well, then the only way I can fix it then is through my works. Well, now I get really, really messed up. I mean, like it seems to be, no matter which way that you take it from that premise, every conclusion seems to be messed up from there. And is there something I'm missing? Because it seems obvious to me, but sometimes it's not. My pastors told me all the time, Peter, whenever you say "can't you see" means they can't. So,
yeah. Well, Peter, at Summit Ministries, we're working with young adults mostly, 16 to 22 years of age. They're coming in. We encourage them, bring all of your hard questions about God. Bring all the questions you would like to ask that are confusing for you in your faith. What I've begun to notice is a lot of the adults who support this ministry have similar struggles. And some of them will actually say, okay, how do I even know that I'm saved? And so the encouragement I try to give to them, I try to listen, hear what their experience is. But my encouragement is exactly what you're saying. You didn't secure your salvation. You didn't save yourself. You can't unsave yourself. That is how I come down on this. And again, I'm telling you up front, I can't coming at this from a Presbyterian. I'm not a very good Calvinist. On my best day, I might reach 4 out of the 5 points, but it seems clear to me that if Jesus is the one who secures our salvation through having been raised by God from the dead and become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, if that is true, then we trust Jesus for salvation, and we trust Jesus for the salvation of everybody. There wouldn't be an alternate path. Anybody who's going to be saved is going to be saved through Jesus. But they're not going to be saved through Jesus because they want to be saved. Not because they're doing good things for him, but because Jesus died on the cross and was raised again on the third day, according to the scriptures.
All right. So, but then you have arguments out there for what's happening right now, because I think we both can agree that Israel's not going to do everything perfect as a country. They're going to make mistakes the same way every other countries make mistakes, and so we still have to kind of have judgment in some form or fashion. But then you have people out there, and again, I'm not going to. They claim they're Christians, and again, I'm not going to say whether they are or not. I that's not mine to say anyway. But I think there's some that's very obvious I could say or not. But like these are three people that I could think of right now, which is Candace Owens, Cornel West, and Reverend Dr. Isaac, and all three of them are pretty much kind of united in this, and there's many others out there like this too, saying that what's happening right now in Gaza is more of a genocide, ethnic cleansing, and that as a Christian we can't support any mass killing regardless of the political context, regardless of what happened. I mean, there's the political arguments of if that happened to us, but from a Christian perspective, I think that's so much out there right now. When Christians hear that, I think it creates confusion. So how should we think about those arguments when we hear people say that? Yeah,
we can clear it up in 90 seconds, don't you think, between the two of us? So there are a number of converging issues. From a Christian perspective, people ask questions about end times, eschatology. What role does Israel play in the end times? And so then people divide up based on whether they're post-millennial, whether they're amillennial, whether they're premillennial. Then you have the question of the military angle. There's no question that Israel's war against Hamas has been withering. Is that wrong, or is it a just war? So there's a question of that. Then there is the question of genocide. When people today use the term genocide, because the organization that's part of the United Nations infrastructure that decides whether something constitutes genocide is called the International Court of Justice. And they have not called what Israel is doing in Gaza a genocide. They've been given repeated opportunities to do so in the last 2 years, and they have refused to do it. They do not call it a genocide. John Spencer, who's America's leading expert on urban warfare, has said that Israel has done more to protect civilians in Gaza than any army in history, including the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan. And whereas typically you would have 9 civilians who end up being killed for every one combatant who is killed, typically in an urban warfare situation, the figure is 1 civilian for every 1 fighter. And I think when
wow.
all of the dust settles, we're going to find out that 3/4 of the people who died were somehow fighting on behalf of Hamas. So then you have the propaganda angle. You have all of these anti-Israel protests that are taking place on campus, not from people who know what the issue really is. There was one pollster who went to one of the protests, and 50% of the people who are chanting "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" could not name either the river or the sea that they were chanting about.
Right.
Why are they chanting against Israel? Well, here's the thing, Peter. They believe that the United States of America was illegitimately founded, but it's too big and too powerful to do anything about. But they're not going to make that same mistake again. Israel's smaller. It's halfway around the world. It's made up of Jewish people. And so who cares if that little nation gets destroyed? That would be a small price to pay, and it would make us feel better for our own colonial ambitions. So all of those issues get wrapped up in this. And then you have someone like Candace Owens, who, quite frankly, is just a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
She, and she doesn't ever defend anything that she says. She says, "Well, I'm just asking questions," right? Which is that's the ultimate dodge, is that you can say whatever you want, and then when people question you, "Oh, I'm just asking questions." But I'm a little more I'm not. I mean, obviously, Candace has a huge voice, but I'm really getting to be more concerned right now by the people in the Christian church who are mostly coming from the Christian left. They hate the idea of private property. They hate the idea that that human beings can actually be productive and grow wealth. They believe that only the physical world exists, so material prosperity is impossible because of scarcity. In other words, if one person has anything more than anyone else, if they stole it, that's the only possible explanation. So they've embraced all these secularist assumptions that are not biblical, and then tried to weave in their theology in such a way that's put them in a very, very, very close to the kinds of things that Martin Luther said about Jewish people, which led to a horrible, probably couple hundred years of mistreatment of the Jews.
Okay, and then you look at others like Tucker Carlson, who that one honestly has kind of shocked me. He seems like he kind of came out of the blue, and one of his arguments is that the Bible doesn't require Christians to support the modern state of Israel. That today's nation state is not the same as the ancient state of Israel, and that it's different between the Jewish people and the nation of Israel. How do we deal with that possibility that he's right?
Is he? Are you referring to his work with Munter Isaac?
I believe so. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, so Munter Isaac is a pastor from the Evangelical Lutheran Church, which in the United States is unbelievably probably the most liberal denomination that there is out there, the most leftist, progressive denomination that there is. So he's a pastor in that denomination. Under his watch, Christians have been almost entirely exterminated or moved out of Bethlehem. So, he's upset, but it wasn't Israel that did this. It was the Palestinians who did this. Nevertheless, he's somehow fixated on Israel. All right. So is there a relationship between the modern state of Israel and the previous two incarnations of the nation of Israel? And I think my answer to the question is yes. Now, why would I say that? Because the modern state of Israel it essentially operates on a divine constitution. When you talk to the people who are there, even the ones who are secular, they say, yeah, basically Deuteronomic law is the constitution of our nation. It is established as a Jewish state. Religiosity is growing there. It's fascinating. They didn't have the benefit of a Christian founding like the United States of America did. It was essentially founded as a secular socialist outpost to try to get people out of Russia and Europe so they wouldn't be killed. And a lot of people there came from that secular viewpoint. And yet, religious Judaism is growing substantially. Messianic Judaism is growing substantially. And I see all the indications that this is in line with the covenant and the things that are happening in Israel today. You can see these as prophecies being fulfilled from the major prophets and the minor prophets of the Old Testament. Some of the specific things that are happening, desert being turned into garden. A lot of the blessings that were there are being fulfilled in the modern state of Israel, which is crazy that it was formed as a secular socialist outpost. And now God is somehow working through this to bring people back to himself and to fulfill prophecy. Do we find that incredible? I don't know. I mean, if you believe that God's covenantal promises are always and forever, then it shouldn't surprise you. If you believe that God divorced the Jews and that the Jews are no longer relevant, then the fact that there's a Jewish state wouldn't mean anything.
Right.
So I don't know. Are people just being obstinate? Are they kind of starting with anti-Judaism and working their way backward? Or have they failed to update their theology from the time of Martin Luther? Because when John Calvin, when he talked about the Jews, he didn't talk about them as an actual physical nation. He said it's a spiritual metaphor because it wasn't established at that time. The Jews had been kicked out of their homeland and scattered all throughout the earth. So if there is a regathering, are we going to update our theology, or are we just going to say, no, nothing good in theology has happened in the last 500 years? So, Israel is only a spiritual metaphor, not an actual physical place. So I feel like everything is more confusing now than when we started the show.
No, I disagree because again, you're right. I mean, everything kind of comes back to this, how do you make it logically sense? Because you're right. If there's supposed to be a regathering, how do people expect there to be a regathering without there being some type of nation state? Do they expect it to be a regathering like as in the time of Judges in modern? I just don't see that. There's too many unanswered questions, I think, from the other side that I don't see what's happening. And I agree with what you said right from the very start. I think propaganda is creating a lot of the issues. So I want to tell you a story and ask you one final question because when I went to Israel, it was, I can't remember the year now, 2014-ish, 2015. It was right when the bombs started coming in from Hamas. It was like as we were leaving, there were some issues there. It started back then. There was a lot of issues that were going on. We were the last people on Temple Mount that day. They had to close it down because of other threats and issues around. But we were in Jerusalem, and we were having breakfast that morning with the group, and my pastor came along and he said, "Hey, I want to let you know we've contacted your families, let them know you're safe." And we're like, "What do you mean?" And apparently and I looked it up because he said, and I questioned him and I looked it up everywhere. But in most of the major papers and major news sources, CNN, from LA to Washington, D.C., there was all these papers showing all these riots that were occurring in downtown Jerusalem. We were in downtown Jerusalem the night before, shopping, watching street performers. Like it was a great time. And I'm like, man, if that's considered rioting, they need to come to Ferguson, LA. I mean, they don't know how to riot. But that just bold-faced lie. I mean, there were tanks and fire, and I mean, all of a sudden the pictures, and none of it happened. So how do we, being way over here, how do we protect ourselves from that propaganda? That's because I would have believed it if I wasn't over there, and because I didn't have any other choice. It was everywhere.
I think it's important for Christians to learn the difference between persuasion and propaganda. Persuasion is using logical arguments to move someone toward the truth. Propaganda is using any argument, logical or illogical, ethical or unethical, to move people to give you power. So you can discern whether propaganda is taking place in several different ways. One is you can figure out what the groups are, what they represent, and what they actually believe, and then try to understand why being against Israel fits into their dogma. That's very easy to do. When you go to a protest, you'll see on the bottom of the posters people are holding up is a website. And there are a bunch of different websites. You can go to those websites and see what they are. They're almost uniformly Marxist, Leninist, socialist, even admittedly communist organizations who are behind it. Then you can look, where do they get their funding from? You can trace it back and realize, oh, so these people have an agenda. And being against Israel somehow fits into their overall agenda. That takes some of the magic out of it. A third thing you can do is start to look at the facts of the situation. What facts are happening on the ground? So, for example, we asked in a poll, do you think the fact that Israel is attacking Gaza proves that they are oppressors? And the majority of young adults said yes. And then we said, do you think the fact that Hamas is run by billionaires who are using their, they're living in villas in Qatar and flying around in private jets, do you think that makes their cause unjust? And when you give the evidence, almost all the people who said, yes, it was Israel's the one being unjust, now said, oh, yeah, well, Hamas is the one being unjust. So you can actually read, Hamas prints all its documents in English. It printed an 18-page justification of the October 7th slaughter of Israeli civilians, men, women, and children, their rape, their torture. It justified all of that in a document that it printed out in English with pictures and everything. So it's not like this is a big secret. If there's any kind of a conspiracy, it's a conspiracy of ignorance on our part because we aren't bothering to look at the facts. So understand the difference between propaganda and persuasion. Learn how to look for the facts of the situation and understand that this is a theopolitical struggle, not just a geopolitical one. It's a question of Islam and various strains of Christianity and Judaism, and it's very complicated. And I'm sorry for the people who think they can just in one sentence figure this all out and then move on to something else. But it just isn't one of those issues. And nobody there believes that it is. You've been probably, if you've been in Israel, you've been in the West Bank. I've been in the West Bank many, many times. I've spent a lot of time with Palestinians. And I will ask them, do you think that America is, or you think that Israel is the little Satan? And oh, yeah. Like virtually 100% of them. Oh, yeah, Israel's a little Satan. Well, who's the big Satan? 100% of them? The United States of America. We are the ultimate target.
So... And you're right. This is not something that we can solve. This is not like a Brady Bunch episode where you could solve all the world's problems in 30 minutes. So for people to find out more, because this is, and other pieces, because again, I know what you do is you help people solve or kind of at least look at the problems today through a biblical lens and a biblical worldview, which is, I think, extraordinarily important, particularly for younger adults, younger people that don't get exposed to it correctly anymore. How do they find out more about what you're doing, about some of the books you've written, anything that's happening right now through Summit Ministries, or to find out more about this topic? Where can they go to look for that?
Yeah, just go to summit.org. You'll find that we have a resource library there. You can find that book, Should Christians Support Israel? Take a copy of that. It's very short, about 120 pages. And a lot of it is a narrative because I'm narrating what happened during my visit there to the war, to the battle space. And you'll be able to read about that. And I'm just giving the viewpoints of people that I heard and then trying to draw some conclusions. The second thing to do is if you know a young adult who's 16 to 22 years of age who would benefit from really knowing how to read scripture well, knowing how to interpret it well, have a biblical worldview that applies to everything, becomes resistant to the counterfeit worldviews, and becomes a sort of leader who loves Jesus and wants to bring blessing and flourishing to the world. That's what we aim to produce. And we do this through 2-week-long programs that take place every summer in Manitou Springs, Colorado, and in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. And during these 2 programs, 1% of Gen Zers have a biblical worldview, according to George Barna. By the time the students finish our 12-day program, 95% say they have a biblical worldview. From 1% to 95%. And then we keep following them. 90%, even 10 years later, say, I'm staying strong to a biblical worldview. So if you know young adults in that who could benefit from that, you can find that information at summit.org as well.
And tell me the ages one more time.
16 to 22 years of age.
That's a great time for people to learn that as well. So, well, Dr. Myers, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate you being here and talking about this. And again, your ministry is awesome. Like I said, for people that age, it's extraordinarily important because of what they're dealing with and the information overload they get from all different sources. It's extraordinarily important that's taught. So I thank you so much for that and for your ministry.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate the opportunity to visit with you today. I really enjoyed it.
Appreciate it. Thank you.